Uh, so to begin with, Shanta, why do people write autobiographies and memoirs?
Yeah, well, when I finally said to myself, okay, let me get this done, because I mean, for the longest time, I've been saying Jerry Pinto nagged me into it, which is the truth. Because never once in my life, writing life, did I get up one fine morning and say, this is the time I must now write about myself. Never, ever. And Jerry just simply got after me, and a point came where I thought that only way to get him off my back was to write it. But there was much apprehension because I had just read something in the New York Times book review. It was a scathing introduction to this critic's review of 4 memoirs, of which he had dismissed 3 and said only one qualified to be read by intelligent people. Now, the introduction, which was scathing, was an excellent measure for me before I launched into my little memoir. I had to know what I shouldn't be doing. Okay, so I've kept this piece of paper. I can throw it away now because this thing is out. But this person says that there was a time when you had to earn the right to draft a memoir. And that right, according to him, belonged to people who had done something noteworthy, had an extremely unusual experience, etc., etc. These things I knew. Then he says, but then came our current age of oversharing. And in that age, he marks down the kinds of memoirs that are being written and ought not to be written. So he says, memoirs have been disgorged by virtually everyone who has ever had cancer. I did. Been anorexic? I haven't. Battled depression? No. Lost weight? Yeah.
I wish I could.
By anyone who has ever taught an underprivileged child, adopted an underprivileged child, or been an underprivileged child. By anyone who was raised in the 60s, 70s, 80s, not to mention the 50s, 40s, and 30s. That covered me completely. However, the last line is, anyone who owned a dog. I've never got on with dogs. Run a marathon. No, I couldn't even do 200 yards, as this book tells you. Found religion? No. Held a job? 4. So I thought, okay, this critic is not going to diss my autobiography straight away. And I think maybe I can launch out. But if you haven't done any of these things to be allowed to write a memoir, then you have to at least write in a way that the reader will find interesting. Now, in order to do that, I had to find a way which I would find interesting because if I did, I expected the reader might. And that is how I launched on this idea of examining my body, organ by organ, and attaching my inconsequential story to my body parts.
So, from being slapped on the bottom just as you emerged from your mother's womb to announce to the world that you were alive, to having your tonsils taken out, to ischemia and through cancer, you sort of take us through the stages of your life. How did you hit upon this device? Were there other devices you considered for telling the story before you fixed on this one?
No, actually, I was a blank because, as far as I was concerned, I had a memory problem. Not a huge memory problem, but certain extremely important things, which, for instance, my sister would casually mention and catch my blank look and say, "You mean you don't remember?" And I wouldn't. So I couldn't trust myself, even with my own story. So there was this blank, and then, as I've been saying to many people, this was my kind of eureka moment. One morning, I got up, and I felt that kind of iron kind of sense of blood in the throat. And I suddenly remembered, of course, that comes from my tonsils. And those were out at that time, some 73 years ago. But the memory was so vivid. And when I remember that, I realized that my memories of the physical events that I have been through are very vivid. And then maybe my body is more interesting to me than whatever I have done in life. So let's begin that way. Let's just look at it. And once I had started writing, the tale just spun out. It was like a breeze after that.
It's difficult to believe that you don't have a memory because it's so vivid in terms of the names of people and places and all of that. Perhaps you should read a passage to give everybody a sense of what your memoir is about.
This is one of the problems I developed after radiation. My voice goes up and down, sometimes disappears, and it's very difficult. Okay. This chapter is called Dark-Skinned in Gothenburg. Nirmal and I were born dark-skinned. In Maharashtra, you were either fair or dark or wheat-colored. Fair was best, wheat was acceptable, dark was sad. Arvind Darkar, my badminton mate from the municipal club, had once asked me to choose a sari for his sister. It was going to be his Bhaubij gift to her. Not having met his sister and men not being observant of their women relatives' tastes in dress, I had no clue what to look for. I fingered the pile of saris that the shop assistant of my favorite shop had thrown on the counter with what I hoped looked like an expert touch. The shop was owned by Gujarati, but the counter assistants were all Marathi. Marathis are clerks, they're poets, playwrights, actors, singers, and sermonizers of the great Shivaji, ready to pull out imaginary swords to lay low anybody who dares breathe a word that suggested that the warrior king was, after all, a human being, not a god. What they were not, if they could help it, were persuasive sellers of goods. Novelist playwright Shyam Manohar, who lives in Pune, told me in the course of an interview for my book on Marathi drama that he once went to a shop in Pune to get a refill for his ballpoint pen. The shopkeeper offered him one, which didn't work. When he asked for another, the shopkeeper said, "You just have to hold this one against a flame for a moment. That will make it flow." In short, if you were paying for goods, it was your responsibility to make them work. The shop assistant who was showing us saris, it was in my favorite sari shop, belonged to this tribe of sellers. At one point, he began sweeping all the saris off the counter and suggested that we try the next door shop. Then, in the brusque way that comes naturally to Marathis, he relented and said, "What is her skin color?" With the greatest delicacy, Aru said, "She is wheat-colored." The man looked suspiciously at him and said, pointing to me, "You mean like that?" Aru nodded uncertainly. "Then that's called dark." The shopkeeper then proceeded to fold up all the bright-colored saris, leaving behind the dull pastel shades. "Any one of these will suit her," he said, his nose very much in the air.
Thanks, Shanta. As you pointed out in the review from the Times about memoirs, this passage doesn't qualify, but I imagine some people who you've written about would imagine that you had overshared. How does a memoirist tackle the problem of possibly offending people that they're writing about? Did you ask them for permission? Did you show them passages?
No, that's dangerous. Never. You have to censor yourself. You go out, you know how people are. I mean, I've dealt with artists. You praise the entire play, and at the end you say, "Of course there is a flaw, so-and-so." You get a phone call. "What do you mean?" People cannot take truth. So, and somehow it didn't ever strike me that I would offend anyone, because it isn't written in malice. If anyone should be offended, it's me, because I've been very brutal with myself. But yes, I think you're referring perhaps to my two husbands. Yeah. Okay. So, point is that if you and your husband have broken up by mutual consent, and it is not a great secret why you have parted, he knows, I know, and the world knows. So there's no reason why it can't be stated as a fact. And that's all I've done. You will notice that most times when I have snarky things to say about people, they're not named. There's one doctor from Glaxo whom I call Dr. Lech, because that's what he was. But I haven't. There was a woman doctor who had a brilliant medical career, and not by a word did she tell me that I was headed for cancer. So Nisha Dakuna, after reading the book, calls me and says, Shanta, but you should have revealed her name. She is doing damage to society. I said, no, it can be human error. And once it goes into black and white, then there's no retracting from it. So it's okay. So I haven't named people, and nobody has been offended. In fact, my first husband's family have all read the book and written to me saying how much they enjoyed it and how very well I have captured their errant uncle, nephew, etc.
Of course, among the prurient delights of reading this book for me is the fact that I've known your son for 30 years. And I see him sort of on the edges of the book through the prism. In fact, I met your daughter only for the first time when your son was having his tonsils removed, one of those acts of the body. And he hadn't...
Appendix.
Appendix, not tonsils, yes. And he hadn't read the book yet. Were you afraid of how your family would respond?
Oh, I'm very scared of Girish. He is a kind of pathologically private person. And, but he is my son. I mean, I can't leave him out. And the only context in which I have mentioned him, if I remember correctly, is that he used to read Wodehouse to me during my chemotherapy, which was such fun. And it was such a brilliant thing to do because he's a good reader. And I discovered him then. So I didn't think he would object to that. I didn't say anything else about his childhood except that the way in which he was born. But he wasn't responsible for that. I was, and the doctor.
There's a wonderful bit that you allude to here, but you've written about in another place, about how when your children were young and you wanted to write, you would tell that you would transform yourself from being I to being Shanta Gokhale. And they would say, Shanta Gokhale is at work, and let you alone. What did that transformation take in your head?
No, I assumed the writer's posture. That was important. And my space for writing was one corner of the dining table. So that was like office. So once I assumed this posture, I could have been rolling out chapatis and wiping my hands on my sari, whatever. But when I came into that space, I was writer. And that's how I comported myself. And they understood that this was serious business. So if I said, look, I'm not I now. For the next 2 hours, I'm Shanta Gokhale. So they would quietly go off and play by themselves. Yeah.
So much of your work has been so closely associated with observing and participating in the cultural life of Bombay. You've charted these changes in so many ways in your newspaper columns, but also in fiction, in Tyavarchi, for instance, which you have translated yourself, as I know, and not Jerry Pinto, even though he gives the impression that he was responsible for it.
Wait, no. I have to correct this instant. He doesn't give the impression. The reader gets the impression because I have said, without Jerry, this translation wouldn't have happened, and the reader doesn't know what I mean is that he's a nag.
But there, you're being as gracious as always. I'm sure he's done things to further that idea. But this is a broad question. As you've sort of looked at the city over all of these years, what are the significant changes you've seen, especially since liberalization? How has this marked the city's cultural life?
Oh, it made a huge change to theater. When I say theater, I mean the kind of off-mainstream theater in which I was involved, and which, to my mind, produced some of the most outstanding work in Indian theater, not just Marathi. Um, it was those decades of the 60s, 70s, 80s was a time when you did theater out of sheer passion and love for the art. So you didn't have prickly playwrights who would say, "What do you mean there's a flaw?" No, people were actually sitting there saying, "Tell me more, tell me more." And we would shred each other's work to pieces and then go out for a party. Now, that could happen because money was not the kind of value it became later on in the 90s. And the whole change started from about 85. So, whereas earlier people would pay out of their pockets to do a play that they believed in, with the production costs going up, rentals going up, this just became impossible. Along with that, the suburbs of Mumbai began to extend and expand, and a lot of theatre people came from the lower middle class at most. So there was this demographic change where the movement of the Marathi middle class was from the center, Girgaon, through Shivaji Park to Dombivli and Dahisar, those far-out suburbs. So it became extremely difficult for people to travel from those places, because these were bank clerks, many of them, and they would finish the day's work and come for rehearsals. And then to go back home at 12 and 1, the whole thing became extremely difficult, and gradually this whole theater movement that had been built from the 60s onwards collapsed completely. So to that extent, it did affect it severely. But now new spaces are coming up. People are doing theater in cafes and bars and small school halls and places like that. Because you can't ultimately keep theater down. You can't do it. In music, the star system became extremely important, because the minute you required sponsorship, and the sponsorship came from corporates, they wanted their mileage for the money that they were putting in. So they would get the mileage only if you were inviting the star vocalists and instrumentalists to perform. So that also became a bind, and the newer voices then weren't heard as much as they used to. So both these things were because, yeah.
To me, one of the works with your, which you're associated that sort of truly capture how Bombay is changing is Art Satya. And there's a scene of Om Puri roaring down on his bike on Senapati Bapat Marg, which has slums, people living in pipes, and it's impossible to recognize that Senapati Bapat Marg now because it's become malls and glassy buildings. And it's got you as an actress in a brief scene as a college lecturer. But also, when you read the credits, you see the intermingling of worlds of playwrights and the new wave. Who were some of the characters in that world, and how did you all manage to work with each other in such a variety of forms?
I think the whole impetus began with the Bhulabai Desai Institute, which had, I think someone was talking about it, Faisal was talking about it in the other. This institute had studios for artists, studios for musicians. For instance, Ravi Shankar had his space there. Al-Qazi had his space there. So there was theater happening, music happening. There was also a puppeteer there upstairs somewhere. And and all these people would mingle with each other. The musicians would go and watch the artists painting, vice versa. So I think it was from that general mingling. And basically, it was those people who carried theater forward. So they continued with these contacts. And Govind Nihalani, for instance, was a great friend of Satyadev Dubey. So he would come for all his plays. Shyam Benegal, because Dubey wrote dialogue for Shyam and for Govind. Govind was Shyam's cameraman. Then he began to direct. Then the same group of people became his actors, his dialogue writers. So it was not, I wouldn't call it a clique. It was a constantly expanding group with this nucleus formed from the Bhulabai Desai Institute.
Perhaps you'll read another passage for us, please.
This is a chapter headed Hair and Heart. It's located in Glaxo Laboratories, where I worked for 9 years. In the next 9 years, I was to gain much knowledge of the affairs of men who went about corporate corridors with flapping ties and bulging files, looking as though the profit motive which drove them was the most sublime force that anybody could desire to be driven by. However, our department was so placed that we were witness to how even the most high-flying managers of the company were brought down to earth by the call of nature. The men's washroom was next to our department. The body has its own compulsions, unconnected with human dreams and delusions. And piss is a great leveler. We saw daily evidence of how vulnerable powerful managers looked when they came out of the washroom under the gaze of 14 female eyes. Had they remembered to zip up? Meanwhile, my hair was graying. A well-meaning supervisor from the factory floor drew me aside to the back of a filing cabinet and said confidentially, "I have a stone that does the trick." The trick? Hair. Hair what? You're going gray? I know, but you're young. Really? But you shouldn't go gray so early. I have this stone. I use it myself. Simple to use. Just rub it in after washing hair. Color does not come off on pillows. That's really kind of you, but I have made a promise to our family goddess that I will never dye my hair. The man looked immediately respectful. I had used this trick on a couple of occasions before to avoid arguments, and it never failed. Once, when the commander-in-chief of the Eastern Naval Command got friendlier than necessary on the dance floor, I did a scared intake of breath and said, "Oh my God, our lunar fortnight for not singing and dancing begins this." Please excuse me, I can't go on. He held on to my hand. "It's a vrat we keep for our family goddess," I explained. He let go of my hand immediately, respectfully bowing me off the floor. That's the advantage of living in a spiritual nation which believes in 33 crore deities, each to be worshipped with her or his own esoteric rituals.
Thanks. I've just been told that we have 5 minutes left, so let's open it up to the audience for questions. Put your hand up and somebody will bring a mic to you.
Shanta, it's a bit more of a comment than a question. It's about not offending people or saying that people don't get offended when you talk about things in the biography or in your memoir, and I know how difficult it is. But unlike you, what I've done is I've generally kicked around. Where I felt I had to say something that I've really put down for a long time, humorously, but I felt I had to put that down. I think different temperament maybe. And then also, I was wondering with you what you did about how do you decide what to omit? Because there's so much that has to be omitted, not because of anything, but sheer space, time, whatever. And that pull that is there between what you feel ought to go in and what you feel, no, this isn't important. I wonder what you have to say about
this device, try it, it's excellent. Just stick to the body. It's objective. No one can say no because you have reports to show. So it really, no one challenges you. And it gives you, as I have said in my introduction, it literally gives you the spine for your story. So if you hold on to some such device, it helps you to select because you can't go too far from the spine if you don't want to be flabby. You want the whole thing to have shape and structure, then I found a way to do it. Because as you say, I mean, I've lived 80 years, and that's 80 years of living. How do you select? And in any case, I think the other point that I think I kept at the forefront of my mind was, why should anyone else be bothered with what a particular incident or event is? So that is also a touchstone. You're talking to readers, and you do want to hold their attention. So that helps you to some extent to weed out stuff which which threatens to be self-indulgent. Just because it happened to you doesn't make it interesting. So that's another way. That's a natural weeding out process. But for me, this worked, so.
That gentleman?
Hello, Stephen from Australia. Do you characterise the culture and society of journalists and how it has changed in the book? And if you don't, could you do that now?
Journalists have changed.
The culture and society of journalists.
I think I've written something about that in the book because the change occurred, in fact, while I was with the Times of India. And suddenly, the editors became subservient to the managers and the marketeers. And we were being constantly shown our plays. And the arts page, which I was running, was literally snapped off because it had served its purpose. Its purpose had benefited the owners, and now they had no use for it. So it wasn't art because art is an important aspect of life. That's not what what their reason for having the arts page was. It was money. And much later on, I was a chairperson of an informal organization called the Music Forum. And the Music Forum was extremely upset that a paper like The Times wasn't carrying music reviews anymore. So they sent a band of powerful women, 3 of them, backed by money and adipose, and they sat in front of the owner himself and said, "What is this? A paper like yours? You don't do music at all." And very genially, the owner said, "You bring us the ads and we will give you the space." So, and a lot of that is in the book because all of us lived through that phase of change.